Abbad ibn Tamim narrated from his paternal uncle Abdullah ibn Zayd ibn Asim radiyallahu ta'ala anhu wa ardah, that he saw the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam lying on his back. Mustalqiyan means to lie on your back, to lie flat on your back, in the masjid. واضعا إحدى رجليه على الأخرى, putting one of his legs over the other, or wrapping one of his legs over the other. So this is one of the ways that the Prophet ﷺ was seen to have sat. In another hadith, وعن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا جلس في المسجد احتبى بيديه. The Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم, when he would sit in the masjid, he would sit in a position that is known as al-ihtiba, and that is to raise your knees up a little bit and to put your hands around your knees, so that from your back and your hands, you wrap your hands around the front of your knees. So sitting normally with your feet flat on the floor, your knees up in front of your face, and your hands wrapped around your knees. Now in both of these ahadith, we need to mention an important point, and that is the covering of the awrah. Some of the scholars mentioned that there are certain types of al-ihtiba, this second type of sitting, that the Prophet ﷺ forbade. And the principle in all of this is that if any sitting position is expected or is feared to lead to uncovering the awrah, then this is forbidden, because of the principle that it leads to haram and the fear that it may lead to the awrah being uncovered. So if a person is sitting, depending on what they are wearing, with their knees in front of their face and their arms wrapped around their knees, and the fear is that their awrah will be uncovered, then this is the kind of sitting which is not permissible. However, how do we reconcile between this and between this hadith that the Prophet ﷺ sat in the masjid with al-ihtiba? He sat with his arms wrapped around the front of his knees. We reconcile between this by saying that he was sitting in such a way that did not expose the awrah. In some of the ahadith, it's narrated that he sat cross-legged. Again, this is a sitting position that, depending on what you're wearing and depending on the length of it and such, and the way that you sit, may be appropriate or may not be appropriate. So when it comes to the sitting of the Prophet ﷺ, it's narrated he lied down on his back with one leg over the other. It's narrated that he sat with his knees up in front of his body and his arms wrapped around his legs. It's narrated that he sat cross-legged. But in each of these sitting positions that is narrated from the Prophet ﷺ, we say that the principle is that the awrah should be in no danger of being exposed. And in all honesty, a lot of this depends on you being comfortable wearing the clothing that you're wearing, because usually where this happens is, for example, in ihram, when people are not used to wearing this kind of clothing. They're not used to wearing a waist wrap with nothing underneath. And so when they sit, they often cause their awrah to be exposed because they're sitting in al-ihtiba, in this way that is narrated from the Prophet ﷺ, with the knees up and the hands around the knees. The problem is that they're not used to wearing this, and so they're not aware of how to sit and how not to sit, and they're not aware of the limits and the ways that the awrah becomes uncovered when wearing this kind of clothing, because they're not used to it. As for the one who wears this clothing all the time, or wears this clothing very frequently, they come from a country where the men frequently wear like a waist wrap around the legs, then they are quite comfortable sitting in many different positions without exposing the awrah, because they're used to the clothing, as opposed to a person who goes on the state of ihram and they're not used to wearing this kind of clothing, and so what happens is sometimes their awrah becomes exposed because of the way that they sit. So we have to be very careful that even if it is reported the Prophet ﷺ sat in a certain way, they should not be exposing the awrah Likewise, lying down in the masjid, the same goes for this. It should not be exposing the awrah. And a lot of this depends on what you wear, and a lot of it depends on how comfortable you are with what you are wearing. باب ما جاء في تكأة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. The chapter of that which has been narrated regarding the leaning or the reclining of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So after Al-Imam At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned the sitting of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam and how he used to sit, as in sit upright, or how he used to lie down on his back, then he came to mention At-Tak'ah, which is how he used to lean. And the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to lean. The meaning of leaning here is reclining or lying back, and not lying flat on your back like mustalqiyan, and not sitting upright as in the hadith of sitting cross-legged, or the hadith of al-ihtiba, of sitting with his arms wrapped around his legs.